But that brings us to 2 o'clock, and we might as well start with maybe some of the spirits of Orkney past, and look at and have a listen to Julie's presentation. So I'm delighted to welcome Julie Cassidy, PhD student at the Institute for Northern Studies.
Hello, now bear with me while I press the share button, and hopefully we'll get my talk up and running. Excellent. Can everyone see that? Thumbs up, Boshin? Yep. Excellent, thank you. So, good afternoon, everyone. I've been wondering if this is the same as the usual post-lunch conference slot, the swag slot, where everyone's a bit sleepy, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes. So, my PhD is entitled Highland Park Sagas and Stills, and it is researching the history of the Highland Park Whisky Distillery in Kirkwall, here in Orkney. But it's much more than a study of just bricks and mortar of the building itself. What I want to look at is the historical and social context in which the distillery began and developed from its earliest days into the global business it is today, and also the stories of the people who lived and worked there. So I'm looking at the history of the manufacture and acquisition of alcohol in Orkney, specifically whisky, really. That should be a new slide, bear with me. Bear with me, everyone. I'm trying to get some new slides up.
If there's a bandwidth issue, Julie, try switching your camera on when you're doing the camera off, sorry, when you're doing the slide sharing. That might free up some bandwidth.
If it's just the slides not advancing, move your cursor to that screen. If you've got 2 screens, and try again. Click on that screen. There you go. Oh, no, right. You've lost the screen now.
All right, I'm coming back. There we go. Oh. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. That was exciting. Okay, so looks like I'm moving screens now. Far too much. Here we go. So just a little idea of the various themes I'm covering in my main thesis. So I'll be looking at the marketing and branding of Highland Park, the other distilleries that have existed in Orkney, both legal and illegal, while Highland Park has been in existence and before, Orcadian identity and whisky, and Highland Park's place within the Orcadian whisky narrative. There we go, and there's a wee picture of Highland Park in the 1920s. It hasn't actually changed very much at all. So the story of whisky and distilleries in general tends to follow a very masculine narrative. Typically, the illicit distillers and smugglers are men. The marketing and branding materials from the earliest days tend to show these rugged men in check shirts rolling barrels around, and you'll see that in that is a Highland Park picture, but you'll see that in most distilleries' websites and magazines. And then we've got men enjoying the whisky, the main consumers. They tend to be the gentlemen, the laird, the traditional piper, which was first used by Jewers in their marketing and copied by many others right up to today. The man in a kilt, sometimes with a stag in the background, so all very Scottish, all very male. Tends to be. But as I research Highland Park in the archives of Orkney and Shetland and Glasgow archives and many other places, these archives are popping up. I'm wondering, where are the women? Where do the women show up within this archive? And so the theme of this conference provided the perfect platform for what I have so far with the history of the distillery and women's role within the whisky narrative of Orkney. So in 19th century Orcadian society, where, due to the majority of work being with the Hudson's Bay Company and the whaling ships, women were a key part of Orkney's economy, working in the kelp and straw plaiting industries, which provided Orkney, or at least Orkney's lairds, with a massive increase in wealth. As we saw from Shona Main's film yesterday, A Crofter's Life from the 1930s, there's really no aspect of domestic or croft life that the woman wasn't involved in. There's no reason to suspect that whiskey making was any different. Now, interestingly, the earliest reference to whiskey in Orkney, to which we can put a personality and a provenance to, rather than simply early 18th century lists of accounts simply saying aqua vitae. It comes from a letter of a woman to her husband. There should be a picture of it there on your screen. In 1793, Frances Balfour writes to her husband, Colonel Thomas Balfour, from the large estate home of Cliffdale in Chappensea, which is now Balfour Castle. And she writes, "I have been brewing whiskey for my own amusement out of the most abominable malt that was ever malted." And we know that 2 years later, in 1795 at least, this is more than a simple domestic enterprise. This is more than just a hobby for Frances. Captain Sutherland writes a letter of complaint to the Reverend George Barry about Thomas Balfour, erecting an extensive distillery for whiskey at his palace in Chappensea, purchasing malt from all over Orkney and selling the whiskey in Caithness. And the 1793 letter, the 1793 letter shows that Frances Balfour is actively managing the estate in a very hands-on way, while her husband's away, being fully aware of the processes and quality of the bare barley required for distilling. Though she's unlikely to have been distilling with her own hands, they certainly would have had staff to do the heavy work. There's an awareness, there's certainly an agency. When Thomas is away, Frances is very much running the estate and its concerns. In 1796, she writes to Thomas, who is at this point working with the Fentables in Northern Ireland, "Though our beer is as good as anybody's, it'll not turn out so well as we expect." Beer being the local Orcadian barley used in whiskey malting. So there we've got the letter and the first-hand account of a rather high-status woman as early as 1793. And from a high-status woman managing an estate and a distillery, a commercial distillery, the nature of archives relating to whiskey production tend to appear in customs and excise records, where people are caught producing ale or whiskey without a license or avoiding paying taxes, or sheriff court records where female vintners and merchants are taken to court by alcohol producers for outstanding debt. And as John Goodlad noted in his keynote presentation yesterday, it's rare to get documents relating to illicit distilling, as it is a clandestine activity. People don't write it down, they don't want to get caught. Although there's certainly some records in Campbelltown and around Speyside that suggest a certain level of openness around the illicit distilling of whiskey. In Orkney, we appear to have a wealth of primary documents in the form of customs and excise files, lists of names of the people caught, licenses to sell ale, what fines, if any, were levied, and letters from defendants explaining to the court or excusing to the court their actions. Of course, it's an incomplete record. There are a few cases we can follow from start to finish. But first, what you have in front of you now is a slide showing some of the material culture of the domestic spirit and whiskey making practice. We have one at the bottom there from Wick, two on the right hand side are from Speyside, and the one at the left is from Chappensea here in Orkney. It's been on display for quite a while in the Highland Park shop in Kirkwall. We've got no provenance information for it other than simply Chappensea. But of course, the material culture can't tell us who used it. But it is clear in these images the fact that a domestic size still does not take up much room. It's very easy to assemble, it's very easy to hide, and there isn't a lot of expense involved in the equipment. There's very little initial outlay to buy one of these stills. Such stills appear in the Orkney Customs and Excise reports. But firstly, just away from whiskey a little bit, ale was brewed in almost every household, part of one of the general tasks of the kitchen and any self-subsisting household. In the late 18th century, a tax was made payable on malt, and while making ale for your own consumption was legal, selling it required a license. In these 1816 excise reports, I've separated and highlighted here the section in what is a several-page document listing everyone who has been caught by the Customs and Excise officer, the section on ale licenses. And all the offenders in this year, in 1816, are women. We have Margaret Cromarty, Mary Ward, Celia Mowat, Isabel Brown, Kathleen Anderson, Margaret, can't read that, Dishorn maybe, and Kathleen Dishorn. They are all accused of selling ale without a license, and they're all fined £2.07, which is quite a bit of money in the at the time. And in the archive, we have a letter from Isabella Brown, mentioned in the previous documents. Bear with me. Simply saying, and what I've just realized everyone's video is just right over where my text is. There we go. I'm just going to move you all down. Sorry. And so this is a petition of Isabella Brown. Humbly showeth that I am summoned at the insistence of Robert Pringle, Esquire, Collector of Excise, for selling ale without a license. I'm unable to attend, my circumstance also being poor and a widow, left with 4 children to support. I therefore please your honour to allow me to pass without any expense, as I'm unable to pay. My husband died in the service of the Hudson's Bay Company some years ago and left me no effects. And this is a common theme in a lot of the letters to the Collector of Excise. Women especially, but certainly not exclusively, saying that I'm a poor widow, I just did it for certain reasons. Forgive me, please forgive me. Please don't fine me, because if you fine me, you're punishing the whole family. Bear with me, I'm having slide issues again. There we go. Back to whiskey. We've got a record citing Margaret Hales from the island of Swinner in 1804, who was reported for distilling or aiding and assisting in distilling privately, found with her a large wash batch or cask standing in the house, lately used for a still house. So this isn't just in the corner of a barn, this is named the still house, so this is quite an enterprise. Also 2 bottles containing faint spirits or spirits of the last extraction. Now the penalty is set at £200, which is a massive amount of money for 1804, but she was apologized, which is essentially acquitted or excused. And I'm seeing a lot in the archives where things are getting to the Customs and Excise Council, the Collector of Excise, Robert Pringle. It's going to court, and they're just let off. They're just let off. So it gets so far, but quite rarely is a fine actually imposed. And another document. Actually, if anything, that Margaret Hales document shows the far reach of the excise officers, as Swinner is about as remote as you can get, really, in the archipelagos here. And she must have thought she was quite safe from detection, but clearly wasn't. Later, in 1818, this document we're looking at here, we've got the record of a woman detected distilling within Thomas Scott's house. And customs reports with this much detail are quite rare, and I've deliberately picked out the ones that have got quite a bit of detail for us. The customs officer writes that he saw through the window the appearance of a still at work in the middle room of the house, but was forcibly prevented from entering it at the time. Returned afterwards with assistance and found some small works and low wines artfully concealed in the barnyard. And another one here in 1824, a letter to the collector of excise from a man who took pity on a mother of a sick child. Some time ago, the woman Margaret Houghton in Nethersdale requested me to supply her with a little malt for the support of a child that she had was very poorly, but sometime declined giving it, but gave her some beer to make herself some malt. Short after this poor woman's child died, and then she had no occasion to use it. I got it returned to me in malt and used it in my house. This is a man who is being accused of selling malt to a poor woman with a poorly child, very much reflecting the role of whisky in remedial healthcare at this time. In 1824, the slide you should see here, it's a letter on behalf of Margaret Fovister, who appears to be taking in travellers. So just reading down the letter here a little bit. You know that 12 months ago I was fined 10 shillings, which I paid. Since then, I've done very little in that line. I was confined for 9 weeks by an inflammation and was fit to do nothing. Since then, I've only had 1 gallon of whiskey from Mr. Robert Spence, and Mr. Grant told me that I should never be charged to court for keeping refreshment for travellers. I would appear in court this time had it not been market day, and I hope what I've already paid will be sufficient for all that I've done this last 12 months. That's quite a cheeky letter, I think. I've already paid. So please let me off. And I was told I wouldn't get in trouble for this anyway. But this record allows me to bring in Theresa Mackay's essay on women at work in keeping in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, 1790 to 1840. In which she describes the women of the rural Highlands and Islands as benefiting greatly from the rise in the number of travellers coming into Scotland in this period, thus a rise in the number of inns. And so in her own words, in Theresa Mackay's words, repositioning women from drink-selling curiosities to strategic businesswomen, innkeepers of complex hospitality operations. Mackay doesn't feature Orkney in this essay, but her assertions about women holding prominent roles in the hospitality industry certainly seems borne out by these records that I'm discovering here in Orkney, and certainly by some travel diaries. But this development of women being granted licenses to sell ale and alcohol licenses was certainly not welcomed by everybody. This is a letter from a local reverend appealing to the town council to be more careful who they give alcohol licenses to, lamenting the number of low public houses in Firth and Stennis, which is the main road between Kirkwall and Scrumness. You will no doubt be surprised when I inform you that there are in this charge no fewer than 12 individuals who are licensed to sell spirits and ale. Some of these are females. Most of them present very unfit, who encourage disorderly contact. And in this final archival document, I've got up here to show you, is with regard to the prosecution of a woman who, when visited by the excisemen, employed obstruction, leading to a hefty fine, a £200 fine, and there's no evidence that this is excused. She had to pay it. Caught malting privately, being only a part of the malting concealed in the dark stables, she refused admittance to the cellar within, concealing said malt and hindering and impeding me in the lawful discharge of my duty, and running off with the key. And this is a pattern, really. It has a very kind of Keystone Cops feel about it, but this is a pattern that I'm finding is, rather than be prosecuted for the malting and distilling of whiskey themselves, the women of the household are often charged and fined with obstructing the excisemen. And certainly in Orkney folklore, featuring in many stories. Tales are of women outwitting and distracting the excise officer, who, while evidence is being removed, and in a very similar manner to the way the press gangs were also outwitted, very similar methods. So in the record, we see letters excusing the purchase and manufacture of whiskey for use in social events like weddings and funerals. The use of alcohol for medicinal purposes, where alternative treatment is not available or is beyond the means. And as an easily accessible way to make money and support the family. Often the women write to the court saying they're widowed or sick, and it's the only way they could either earn money or they were desperate. They were desperate for the extra money. And Devine writes about whiskey making in Highland society, where in place of the large-scale industry and capitalism in the south, what appears in the Highlands is the emergence of a peasant enterprise, and I'd argue that certainly seems to be the case in Orkney. And Glenn suggests that the reason women played a significant role in illicit distilling is that for widows, the returns from a small-scale distillation would be an invaluable income supplement, and distilling fits easily into family economics. Okay. And the practice of illicit distilling is vastly reduced with the introduction of the 1823 Excise Act, which makes legal distilling viable. Previously, it wasn't really viable because of the cost of the malt and the cost of the fines and the taxes, but the taxes, not the fines. So with this final slide, I come on to a 200-year history of women in legal large-scale distilling. On the bottom right there's a picture of Elizabeth Cummings. In 1811, Helen and John Cummings leased Cardew Farm in Knockando, Speyside. And in 1816, John is convicted of malting and distilling privately, but local folk tales recount that it was actually Helen operating the stills from her kitchen, while also warning her neighbouring illicit distillers of visiting excisemen by displaying a red flag on the hill from their vantage point on the hill. They apply for a licence in 1824 after the Excise Act. And in 1832, the now award-winning Cardew distillery was passed on to their son, Lewis. Lewis dies in 1872 and his widow, Elizabeth, takes over. And over the next 2 decades, Elizabeth developed the distillery to become one of the most sought after whiskies by blenders. That is an interesting origin story. It seems to be quite unique as an origin story in the distilleries. Lots of the distilleries have an illicit origin story, but this is the first one, the only one to, well, be a woman, and that's the Cardew's kind of the USP, I guess, when it takes you on a tour. In the bottom left, we've got Bessie Williamson, who was the only female to own and run a Scottish distillery in the 20th century. In the summer of 1934, she went on holiday to Islay and applied for a job as a shorthand typist at Lafroig, gradually moving up through the company before inheriting the distillery from its male owner in 1954, and winning great acclaim for her role in a very male-dominated business. Top right, there's a picture of Miss Babs Robertson, one of the founders of Edrington in the 1960s. And the current owners of Highland Park are Edrington Limited. They're also the sponsors of my PhD. Inheriting Robertson and Baxter Limited from their father, the 3 Robertson sisters took over the whisky business and created Edrington Limited, and now one of Scottish whisky's biggest operators, owning Highland Park, Famous Grouse and Macallan, as well as several others. And from a company founded by 3 remarkable women, Highland Park is now managed by Marie Stanton since 2005, a graduate of the Heriot Bott Brewing and Distilling degree. So from the beginnings of economic necessity and illicit manufacture, the role of women in Orkney's whisky story becomes one of ownership, management, and a global market. So we move from the illicit to the corporate and successful in 200 years. There we go. So I'd just like to thank everyone for providing archives and advice for this. As I say, this talk was very much, this conference was a good excuse to look at the women involved in Orkney's whisky narrative, and it, apart from the current owners and the current manager, the role of women in Orkney's whisky narrative certainly seems to be out of economic necessity, I've found. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julie. That was absolutely fascinating, and yeah, really eye-opening to see a dimension in what was going on in people's homes, and sort of almost under the radar of the record keepers, but obviously surfacing enough that we can get glimpses of what was going on. Absolutely fascinating, and looking forward to some good discussion about that afterwards. And I can see there's some really nice comments and questions appearing in the side in the chat there, so hopefully we'll get to them shortly. I'm going to move swiftly on now to our next speaker, who is another PhD student at the Institute for Northern Studies, Annie Thuesen, who is going to be moving from the past to the present and looking at the development of Orkney as a tourist destination. So hopefully the presenter privileges are being passed to Annie as I speak, and that's perfect. Excellent. Okay, well, it's all yours, Annie.
Thank you very much. And here we go. And I'm not actually only going to be talking about the present. I'm going to be trying to talk about the past, present, and future of Orkney as a tourist destination. But I want to start somewhere slightly different and try to just address the elephant in the room at the moment whenever you talk about tourism, which is, of course, the coronavirus pandemic and the effect it's had on tourism everywhere in the world at the moment. As you can see there from the graph, it's just meant a really massive decrease in tourism activity globally throughout 2020. And I'm not going to talk about that in any detail just now. I just think it's a very potent reminder of how the development of tourism in any given destination is just really massively impacted by really big events that usually has nothing directly to do with tourism, and that in any case is just completely outside of the power of the destinations themselves. So that can be like global health crisis like this one, but also just big political events, just like Brexit, for instance, political unrest at the destination itself, things like economic fluctuations, or just global travel trends or lifestyle trends, or it can be environmental disasters, ash clouds, things like this. And just because we've had such a big reminder of that in these last few years, I thought I wanted to go through the history of Orkney as a tourist destination by just pointing to some of these big national and global events that has happened, which has really affected that history. And I wanted to start with this guy, Sir Walter Scott, and a big national literary event that happened in 1821, which was the publication of a book of his, a novel, The Pirate. And I know it's not one of his better known books today, but at the time it was really a big event. Like, this book it never went out of print for the rest of the 19th century. And it was, there was a play made, and there was a children's version made, and an illustrated version made, and there was lots of the songs in this book also just became popular tunes in their own right. So it was everywhere. And what's really interesting about The Pirate was that it took place in Orkney and Shetland, and the location was just really important, both for the plot and for the mood of The Pirate, because Vikings were very popular at the time in Victorian Britain, and Walter Scott really used the Viking heritage of Orkney and Shetland, even though the story takes place in the 17th century, but somehow all the characters, they all invoke the Norse gods all the time, and they know all the Viking sagas. And this just meant that the readers became really interested in Orkney and Shetland, and it started this big trend of literary tourism to the Northern Isles. And tourism really did go up. You can see it in the guidebooks of the time. I've taken some different quotes from some of the guidebooks around 1900. And you can just see that for many of the attractions in Orkney, they were clearly just interesting because they had some kind of connection to the pirate. So it says, for instance, there on the left about Edie. Edie is one of the small islands in Orkney. It says that the most interesting thing about it is that this was where John Gow was caught. And John Gow is a famous Acadian pirate, and he's a historical person. But he was also just interesting because he was the prototype for the titular pirate in Sir Walter Scott's novel. And Stromness as well. You can see there's a quote about Stromness on the right. Stromness was a very interesting place at this time in the guidebooks, because for one thing, it was where Bessie Milley had lived. Bessie Milley was the prototype for another person in this novel who is called Norna of the Fitful Head. So I'm sure Bessie Milley would have been delighted about that. But it was also where John Gow himself had lived. So his house was there, and it was pointed out to the tourist as well. And there was also a house where Sir Walter Scott himself had stayed when he was up to visit Orkney before writing The Pirate. So all these things were pointed out in the guidebooks, and everybody was very excited about it. But obviously, the pirate was not the only reason why tourism to Orkney went up in the 19th century. A lot also happened in terms of transport infrastructure, which is always very important to tourism, and especially very important to island tourism. So in 1833, there was a regular steamship service going to Orkney. It went from, I think, Leith, Aberdeen to Wick to Kirkwall. And this was the first time ever we actually had a regular service to Orkney, so that obviously made a huge difference. But in general, ship connections they became a lot better throughout the 19th century. And the railway reached Thurso in 1874. So that obviously also made things a lot easier, especially because 8 years later, a regular ferry was introduced on the Scratch to Stromness route. So Scratch is just next to Thurso, and Thurso is just across the water from Orkney. Sorry, I forget that not everybody knows everything about the Orkney geography. So access became quite a lot easier. I say easier, but it still wasn't easy. I mean, you still have to understand that Orkney was still a destination for the intrepid travelers at this time, despite all the guidebooks and despite all these kind of advantages. And the next really big improvement in transport didn't actually happen before about 100 years later. So in the 1970s, big things started to happen again. So we got a ro-ro ferry, a roll-on, roll-off ferry. So the ships, the cars could just drive directly onto the ferry. Whereas before they had to be lifted over, like you can see in this picture here. That's still the case on some of the small islands in Orkney, so that's where I got the picture from. So that made a huge difference. It also meant that coast tourism was a thing now in Orkney because the coaches could actually get on the ferries. The air service also became much better in the 1970s to Orkney. I mean, you could go to Orkney by plane before. I think even in the 1930s, Aberdeen Airways had package holidays to Orkney. That stopped with World War II. But it just became much more a comprehensive service in the 1970s. And these things happened for a reason in the 1970s, which leads me on to our great event number 2, the discovery of North Sea oil and gas. And I have to say that this also had a huge impact on Shetland, probably even better, more than in Orkney, but I'm just talking specifically about Orkney here. So the oil and gas reserves in the North Sea were discovered in the 1960s, and they were exploited in the 1970s. So that meant a lot for Orkney and Shetland. It brought a lot more income, brought a lot more jobs. Also meant lots of developments, as I just said, in terms of infrastructure to the islands, transport infrastructure, but also in terms of developments within the islands themselves. And a lot of these developments were of a type that just made them a lot more appealing as tourist destinations. So I just have to, right. So yeah, the access was easier, the access to the islands, but also the inter-island access became much better. So the inter-island ferries, the inter-island planes. So that made it much nicer for tourists to come, you know, sightseeing became a lot easier. Visitor facilities also vastly improved because all these business people started to come up because of the oil and gas. Obviously, they wanted hotels, they wanted nice restaurants, they wanted to be able to rent cars and so on. So all these things started to crop up, and that was very useful for tourists as well. The local authorities also started to use all this money they got in because of the oil and gas to actually invest in some basic facilities, also for the outlying areas. I mean, just things like electricity and, you know, running water, things that they hadn't necessarily had before, which was great for the residents, but it also made it nicer for tourists to go to these kind of places. The local authorities also started to use some of the money they got in from the oil and gas to invest in tourism marketing in the 1970s and 80s, especially in the 80s, though, because the kind of the oil and gas boom had started to wane off by then. So you needed to get more tourists in to actually fill up all those hotels and restaurants that had been built. So that was kind of some of the things that happened. And Shetland and Orkney were both in quite a good position in the 80s to attract the tourists, because evidently they had this nice island feel, and they were quite rural areas, but they still had those nice facilities, had much better facilities than other rural areas in Scotland. Still, they were still in the same position that they were quite difficult to access, and they were quite expensive places to get to, expensive and time consuming. So they were by no means mass tourist destinations, even at this stage. You could say obviously that this was a blessing, and many people said so. I've included a quote here from, this is a geographer, Richard Butler, who has worked quite extensively on Orkney and Shetland, tourism in Orkney and Shetland, but especially Shetland. And this is a quote from the 1990s, where he says that the spectre of overuse and overdevelopment, which frequently haunts many small island destinations, is not likely to affect the Northern Isles. And what he's talking about here is that there's usually talk about how tourism is kind of a double-edged sword for small island destinations, because obviously these places are fairly vulnerable. They usually have fragile ecosystems, they have small economies and so on. So they can quite easily suffer from negative externalities of tourism, especially if a lot of tourism comes at the same time. But as he said, and as he argues in this article, the Northern Isles were fairly protected against this because they had very short seasons because of the weather. So the tourism, you know, there's a natural limitation to it. They were difficult to get to, as I just said. And obviously there's a natural carrying capacity limit on the ferries and the flights. So, you know, there's not that many tourists coming, naturally. However, this too has been challenged in recent years because of major event number 3, which is something as old-fashioned as a global tourism trend, the rise of cruise tourism. And I've tried to gather some numbers. As you can see, there are a couple of years that I couldn't really find very reliable numbers for, but the general trend in global cruise passengers is quite clear. As you can see from 2004, between 2004 and 2018, the number has more than doubled. And it's kind of the same in Orkney. It's actually even stronger between 2011 and 2019. So within the last decade, numbers have almost quadrupled, the number of cruise passengers. We still have more overnight visitors than we have cruise passengers in Orkney, but that's because overnight passengers also include visiting friends and relatives and business visitors. If you don't have these, if you only count leisure visitors, we do actually now get more cruise visitors than overnight visitors. And this has been a massive, massive game changer for Orkney. For one thing, it means that we're not protected in the same way that we was before, because if you're a cruise passenger, then obviously the travel is part of the enjoyment. So it doesn't matter that it takes a long time to get to a place. And there aren't these natural limitations on ferries and flights that we used to have. We don't get as many cruise passengers as many other destinations in Orkney. If we look at this picture, for instance, this is from Geiranger in Norway. They get around 300,000 cruise passengers compared to around 140,000 in Orkney. And their main village has got 250 inhabitants, whereas in Orkney, our main village is Kirks. We got about 8,000, 9,000 inhabitants. So you can imagine that they're going to feel the impact of cruise tourism much stronger than we do. But the thing with cruise tourism is that the impact from it is not just a question of numbers, it's also a question of how cruise passengers behave. Cruise passengers are subject to some limitations which other tourists aren't. Like, they have much more limited time in the destination, and they usually have much less knowledge of the destination just because they go so quickly from one place to another. And that means that cruise passengers just tend to congregate in the same few areas in a destination, because those are the places that they have the time to go to, and those are the places that they know about. So that means that these few areas tend to just suffer disproportionately under the impact of the tourists. And that is the case in Orkney as well. So especially these two places, Kirks, which see most of the it's a main port of call for most of the cruise ships. And heart of Neolithic Orkney, which is the World Heritage Site in Orkney, very popular with tourists, especially very popular with shore excursions. It's just it's very, very convenient for them and a nice attraction. So they have been very massively influenced by cruise visitation, and that has had some negative consequences. They're different. The impacts are quite different. So in Kirkwall, it's mostly been a question of social sustainability. So my particular research is into sustainability of tourism in Orkney. So I've interviewed quite a few people around this question. And one person I talked to, she has been involved in the cruise tourism business in Orkney from the very beginning. And she said that when it just first started, it wasn't really managed. So emotions went really high. People were fairly incensed about it. And she said people would just shout at her in the supermarket, and it was quite horrendous. It's not as bad as that now. It's better managed. There's, for instance, a cap on the number of cruise visitors per day. But there are still tensions about it. So you can see the posts I got there. They're quite recent. They're from my own research. So they're from 2019, 2020. And that's just normal Orcadian residents that clearly feel that cruise visitors are a problem for just normal residents going around their daily business in Kirkwall. So yeah, that is a definitely a problem, definitely a tension, which I just never came across when it comes to non-cruise visitors. In terms of the World Heritage Site, it's more a question of environmental sustainability, and it's especially a problem at two of the monuments, the Ring of Brodgar, which you see in the photo there. That's a Neolithic stone circle and henge, and Scarrow Bay, which is a Neolithic settlement. So those two sites both suffer from erosion, not only because of cruise visitors. It's got to do with climate impact, and it's got to do with footfall erosion from all kinds of visitors. But Historic Environment Scotland, who manage those sites, are particularly concerned about cruise visitors, and that's just because the cruise visitors come in big groups and they come within a very short season. So 75% of them come between June and August, and that just means that their impact is very, very intense. So they are quite a big problem at these sites. And they cause other problems as well. The shore excursions from the cruise ships usually come in big coaches. The infrastructure in Orkney is not necessarily set up for this. And the non-cruise visitors in Orkney are not necessarily coming in order to have to fight their way through big groups of coast tourists. That is a problem. We can see that starting to get a problem. So there are just many things that the destination has to manage around cruise tourists, and they're not necessarily doing that very well at the moment. And that's something I talked to tourism stakeholders, local tourism stakeholders as well, about in my research. And I've included one of the quotes from one of my interviews here. This is a destination management stakeholder, because I thought she expressed it quite well, how this is just a new problem that we've had to cope with in Orkney. So she says, I think that before that, the cruise boom, we hadn't taken a strategic approach at all. It's been about growing, really, just as and when and how, wherever the demand is. But now we're thinking, hang on, we've got to get a handle on this. And so this last few years, when I've been doing my research, I can see how they've been trying to do that. The destination management organisations, the council, the other stakeholders, such as Historic Environment Scotland, they've really been trying to manage tourism better in the light of this big increase. But then obviously, in the middle of all these efforts, something else happened, and we're kind of back where we started. Obviously, such a big event and the big impact it's had on tourism means that it's also had impacts on Orkney and its tourism industry. The question is evidently how big and how transformative these impacts are going to be, which is really, really difficult to say, especially as we're just not at all out of the woods yet as concerns the coronavirus pandemic. There are some numbers, though, from a survey that was made at the end of last year about the impact of the pandemic on the tourism industry in Scotland. So I took some of the numbers out that relates to Orkney, because I thought they were quite interesting. So what happened in Orkney was that last year, they lost pretty much the entire cruise season, and also obviously much of the non-cruise season, because the first lockdown here in the UK was from the 24th of March till the 15th of July. So that in theory left the rest of the season for domestic visitors, but as you can see that 36% of the tourism businesses here just chose not to open at all. And evidently turnover was down for everybody. This year, it seems as if we're going to be opening for domestic tourists by the end of this month. International tourists, we don't really know yet. So evidently, the question is whether this is going to be a temporary blip for these few years, or whether there's going to be really, really long-term impacts. And for that, I think it's interesting to look at the other numbers there and see what the business owners and managers said that they thought would be the future for the businesses. You can see many of them had made changes to their business or expected to do so, but only 8% actually didn't expect that their businesses would survive. So that for me indicates that this is probably going to be an uncomfortable rumble rather than a seismic change to the Orcadian tourism industry. Unless evidently they want it to be a seismic change. And in that context, it's quite interesting to look at the scholarship, actually, the tourism scholarship that has come out after the COVID pandemic, because a lot of people have pointed out that destinations can actually use this reset, even though it has not been welcome. They can use this reset to rethink their tourism and think how they can maybe use it for just making it more sustainable, making tourism more sustainable for the destination. And that context has been quite interesting to look at this economic review that came out for Orkney last year, because it says that it has, upon speaking to many stakeholders within the Orkney economy, found that there was a mood that maybe we could change tourism here and get fewer but higher paying visitors in order to reduce the negative externalities we've experienced from tourism. And it doesn't say so directly, but I assume that by this they mean less cruise visitors, more overnight visitors, given that I think the daily spend of a cruise visitor is around 41, I have it written down, £41 a day, whereas for an overnight visitor it's more than twice that much. Yes, 41. Yeah, an overnight visitor it's £93 a day. So it's quite a big difference. And actually I've seen, this sounds quite a lot to me, but I've seen that out of the whole tourism, out of all the money that tourism gives to the Orkney economy, day tourism, so cruise tourism, is only 6% of that. However, I haven't seen any evidence of a policy change in Orkney to this respect. On the contrary, last month there was talk about maybe domestic cruise ships will start again from mid-May in the UK. And there was a spokesperson out from Orkney Islands Council saying that they will be welcome here back as soon as restrictions allow. And even a few days ago, I heard on the BBC Orkney radio that the head of marine services in Orkney has been in talks with the local or the domestic cruise companies again, and say that they're coming up as soon as possible. So it seems as if it will be business as usual. But that's a good note to end on, I think, because it just stressed that although the development of tourist destinations over time is very much affected by outside events, as I've tried to point out throughout this talk, it also is really crucial how stakeholders within the destination choose to respond to such events. And I think that's me. I think I spent my time.
Thank you very much, Annie. Another absolutely fascinating paper there, and very pertinent to, of course, all of the challenges that we're facing at the moment. And it's it must have been quite interesting, to say the least, new dynamic to your PhD research, to have had this very much curveball thrown into things so late in the game, really. But absolutely, absolutely lots to think about. Now we'll move quickly on now to Fleur, and hopefully we'll have a chance to have a bit of a discussion after Fleur's paper on all of the papers we've got there. So I see that Fleur has everything set up. So yes, please go ahead.
Brilliant. So thank you very much, Oshin. It's great to speak at this event. It's also amazing to speak after two of my PhD colleagues, because we see each other often, most days, but don't normally talk so in depth about our research together. So this is fantastic to hear what they're up to, as well as for me to be able to share with them what I've been up to. So excellent. So my presentation is called The Role of Different Information and Communication Technologies in Connecting Orkney to the Wider World. And it relies on some of my PhD research. And in the greater sense, my PhD research covers the themes of connectivity, governance, and ICT use. In this conversation, I'm only going to focus on Orkney, but my greater research focuses on Orkney, Shetland, the Outer Hebrides, some of the Irish Islands and the Faroe Islands as well, just to give you some context. So for this conversation, I'm going to try and cover Orkney's past, present and future. So strap yourselves in. I'm going to have a very brief outline of the information age in Orkney. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the telegraph, then I'm going to talk about the current period, and then some ideas about what might happen in Orkney's future. So the telegraph. The first mention in the archives that I found for Orkney being connected to the telegraph is through the Danish-Norwegian-English telegraph company. And they created a submarine telegraph link between London and Norway between 1868 and 1869. And the telegraph system made landfall across the east coast of the United Kingdom. And it also touched on Shetland before heading over to Norway. And special compensation was given to the company to build into Lerwick. In April 1869, the Central Post Office in London granted the company permission to extend the submarine cable to stations across the Northern Isles in both Kirkwall and Stromness. Unfortunately, this is where the record stops for this company, so I can't give you any more information on that, but it is briefly, that's the start. Following this is the creation of the Orkney and Shetland Telegraph Company, and they operated in both Orkney and Shetland. The operations began in 1869, and the funding for it came from what we term today as crowdfunding in the community. They raised £25,000 within the island communities to sponsor the development. The records don't state, though, whether or not the company was working in a relationship with the Danish-Norwegian-English company. So it's kind of sad that I can't actually make that link for you. So by 1873, the company had extensive coverage of both Orkney and Shetland. They developed 179 miles of cables and 215 wires had been built out of the network. So if I go to the map on this new slide, it shows Orkney and it shows the land and the sea cables. So from the green at the bottom is on the island of Hoy. So the cable travels through Hoy, then it crosses the Firth over to the West Mainland, travels between Stromness and Kirkwall, it then travels across to Shappensea, to the island of Stronsey, and then up through Sandy, forming a backbone, and then it travels up to Shetland. And coverage was built out from this system in a network of wires to further extend it. And the telegraph was the two main offices for it. There were other offices, but the two main ones were in Kirkwall and in Stromness. So the telegraph was utilised by islanders, business and the fishing industry. The table on this slide shows the operational telegraph stations in both Kirkwall and Stromness and how many telegrams were being received and forwarded in 1876. So the data clearly illustrates that telegraphs were a form of communication. They were being used. And potentially the high use in Kirkwall and in Stromness is because they're the major population centres on the islands. They're also a hub on the islands for transport and the movement of goods and the movement of people. And geographically in the archipelago, they're both central regions for islanders to gather. So the telegraph was the domain of both men and women. Both worked in the industry and both worked using the equipment. This is an image on the right of Margaret Sinclair at the Sandy Post Office from the early 20th century. On the left is pictures of the buildings that she was working within. Margaret was working on the machinery and deciphering messages. It's interesting that mostly in the records, women's voices are largely absent from the written archive. They tell her that this, with Margaret, she tells of work at the office. She also records complaints about noises outside the office, interfering with her ability to decipher messages, and affecting her hearing, making strains on her hearing. And there were suggestions from her complaints that they would build a soundproof room and make better equipment available to her. And Margaret was operating the only wireless telegraph on the island from 1910 to 1946. Margaret's work was in conjunction with getting connected with other islands. So she was talking to Heidi, which is one of the other Northern Isles, but also North Ronaldsay. William Scott, who is here pictured on the left in front of the North Ronaldsay office, operated a Morse key, which is here on the right in the slide. He'd been given training in Edinburgh on how to handle and maintain radio equipment, and he'd also been given training on how to use Morse code. William became known with the nickname of Wireless Willie, and with the help of an engineer who became stormbound on the island, he created his own long-wave tuning unit, and through its use he could receive weather forecasts from other places, and the longest range this was from France, and actually the Eiffel Tower, which I find quite interesting. So anyway, on to the current period, and the role of broadband and mobile capabilities now. So connectivity has strengthened Orkney's links to the global information economy. As shown on this map, Orkney is connected to the wider world through the Schaefer 2 cable, and this cable consists of high-tech fibre optic lines. The cable joins together Orkney, Shetland, the Faroe Islands, and mainland Scotland. It's from a network built out from the submarine cable that connectivity comes to the islands. So Orkney's connectivity is also regulated, and this comes from the UK's telecommunication regulations, which are deferred to by the Westminster government in London. Orkney comes under the UK government's policies and regulations for universal coverage, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, and the UK telecommunications provider regulator Ofcom. The Scottish Government has its own initiatives, including the Digital Scotland Superfast Broadband Programme, and also the Reaching 100%, or otherwise known as the R100 programme, which aims to reach universal coverage. The map on the right is the procurement lots for the R100. And as you can see in the green, Orkney sits with Shetland and the Outer Hebrides. 95% of the population in Scotland has connectivity, whereas the last 5% are in the hard to reach places, which includes Orkney. So Orkney is due to receive a number of different connectivity solutions under the scheme. So connectivity has become a lifeline for our islanders, and even more so in current times. In this section of the talk, I could pick many different areas to talk about, from renewable technologies, to education, to broadcasting, but I've only chosen one. So one of the ways that it is now currently used is remote work. And this has not always been the case, as until very recently, remote work wasn't as commonplace or everyday as it has become over the last year. It's due to the increasing accessibility and availability of digital connectivity that Orkney, like many other islands, is becoming sought after and attractive for individuals to move to so that they can work. And connectivity is being harnessed and capitalised on to change as employment for individuals is moving away from traditional occupations in the islands, like agriculture. So the trend for remote working has paralleled the development of digital skills, transformations in ICT, and infrastructure development. And some remote workers have been mindful in adjusting and tailoring their skills to their island locations. And a long-time supporter of remote working has been Highlands and Islands Enterprise. They're a key agency of the Scottish Government who promote opportunities for individuals and businesses across the region. HIE's top priorities include education, building the labour market, and developing skills. They work with employers, investors, individuals, and they increase remote working opportunities in tailor-made solutions. So one of the businesses in Orkney that have been supported by HIE has been Kylo. It's part of a cache of technology companies in the archipelago, They're based in Kirkwall and they use an online platform for their business and have no local clients. Employees have a very technical skill set, and in 2019, the business had around 30 employees based in Kirkwall. Half of the company's employees have moved to Orkney to undertake their employment, and this has been incredibly positive for the community at large because they've brought their families with them and money is spent locally. One example from the pandemic in the last year of how connectivity has helped island businesses is the involvement of creative businesses in the Isles 20 website. This was created by an islander in an island off the west of Scotland, and Orkney has a page. And the website was created at the beginning of the pandemic when the tourist season would have normally been starting, but obviously lockdown occurred and we were all stuck on our islands or at home. So it was to counter the lack of revenue that tourists were going to supposedly create, and to provide a possible revenue stream for island-based creatives. The website has been built as a directory of island businesses so that consumers can shop from island-based producers, and listings can be viewed by islands and category. So for the future, Orcadians express desire around connectivity and aspirations for further connectivity. They want equality with mainland areas, and I'll demonstrate this through the next couple of slides. So the aspiration for universal coverage appeared in an article in February from the Orcadian, which is the local paper. It was titled, "Orkney Islands Council to investigate high-speed internet solution." The article considers the failure of the Scottish Government's R100 programme to provide universal coverage to all islanders. The article states a specialist consultant has been hired to investigate whether a high-speed network could be established in the islands. The example shows that the Island Council has a desire to pursue options to provide universal coverage throughout the archipelago and not wait for the Scottish Government to implement their schemes. Orkney has also been a testbed for new connectivity technologies, which may provide connectivity in the future. So this was demonstrated in 2019 as Orkney was part of the Rural First 5G trials, which aimed to improve digital connectivity. So the trial aimed to determine how the next generation of wireless networks might revolutionise day-to-day life and work. Trials explored smart farming, radio, connectivity for the Internet of Things, and other rural industries. The trials were set up across the archipelago. So the trial with the most publicity was held in Stronsay. This was initially for 8 weeks before being extended to 6 months. The provision of 5G was not concerned with filling in connectivity hotspots on the island, which did exist, but they aimed to trial connectivity capabilities. The BBC was running this trial, and they wanted to understand how 5G could be used to respond to the growing demand for online and iPlayer services. The image on the left-hand side is the mast for 5G, which was controversially put on the Stronsay school. And participants in the scheme were parents of secondary age students who were given handsets and speaker. The image on the right of the screen shows the 5G enabled smartphone. So 19 phones were distributed with access to Bluetooth and wireless capabilities. The trial meant that online capabilities could be used to engage with education resources and popular culture. And generally, islanders found that the connectivity strength did increase. There was a hype around 5G at this time in the island, and there was a backlash around it as well. The backlash was caused by some of the Stronsay residents, but it was also by individuals located elsewhere. It was concerned with the health risks around 5G. Government figures thought the backlash agenda was being pushed but not founded on concrete evidence and fueled by social media as a 5G Facebook group existed. And I've shown this on the left-hand side of the slide. On the right-hand side of the slide are letters to the editor that I actually received when I wrote about 5G in an article. And this is appearing in the local paper. So it was quite a topical issue at the time. Islanders believe that the council was shocked by the negative response to 5G, and conversations around the backlash were more or so focused on the dissemination of information amongst the community, lack of consultation, and the management of community expectations and needs. My fieldwork showed that most of the island's population had either no interest or worry about 5G. One islander responded to 5G and the backlash by stating that they didn't care if it fried their brain. They felt that the backlash was excruciating and very embarrassing for the island. And some islanders responded more positively as the connectivity was more consistent and faster than what they'd been previously using. So to conclude, the role of technology and connectivity to make connections between Orcadians and the wider world have been being used for quite a long period of time. Present endeavours showcase the desire to be part of a global information economy, and that connectivity is not only part of everyday life, but it's also being adapted to suit the needs of individuals. Into the future, Orcadians want accessible universal coverage, and there's also an interest in new and evolving connectivity technologies and how they can be used by islanders. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Fleur. And yeah, another absolutely fascinating and highly topical paper. I was quite struck by some of the reading some of the letters you put up there, some of the responses you got. Quite emotive, it has to be said. Yes, yeah, beginning with yeah, how long do you microwave a baby for? I noticed at the top of one of the letters there. So yes, certainly got people talking anyway, which is a good thing, I suppose. But great. I think we can have we've got about 10 minutes for discussion and questions, and I can see there's a lot of them flooding in there. So I'm sorry if we don't get to absolutely everything, but lots to think about. One, I think, to start off with for Julie, it's from Jim Bright. Formerly of this parish, as they say, but now based elsewhere. So hello, Jim. But great to hear from you. Hi, Julie. You mentioned the advertisements always tend to portray men. Are you aware of any advertisements which were aiming to sell whisky to women? You'd think that they'd want to sell to as a wider market as possible. That's an interesting one. Is it? Have you come across anything along those lines?
I mean, that's true, and you might have known I spotted Jim's question, and I went running around the house trying to find a brilliant book that I've got called The Art of Whiskey, which has got, you know, pages and pages of different whiskey adverts. Of course, it's not here when I want it to be. What you tend to get with the majority of whiskey advertising is you either get heritage marketing, which does include the guy with the piper and the laird and the kilts, or you get marketing of place branding, which certainly is used in Orkney, where they're using the landscape. You look at the beautiful landscape, look where this whiskey was made. And then, of course, you do get the generic ones. So White and Mackay has got the two lovely black and white dogs, and Famous Grouse has got that fantastically animated themed grouse. But I can't think of one that is specifically targeted to women at all. So if it's not landscape, or if it's not a cute animal, which, you know, I don't think would put women off buying whiskey, then you do tend to get the traditional Scottish laird, the man, you know, with a stag in the background. It's not universally the case, but that does seem, I can't think of any exceptions at the moment.
That's really interesting. It's just fascinating. Your response there was just making me think of advertising that you get for soft drinks. And one really fascinating trend, I think, recently is that most fizzy drinks now have two diet versions. They've got like so-called like Diet Coke, and they've got Coke Zero. There's Diet Pepsi, there's Pepsi Max, there's Diet Iron Brew, there's what's it called, Iron Brew Extra. In all cases, the sweeter one is marketed at men, and the less sweet one is marketed at women, which is just always really interesting. But
that is interesting. I hadn't realised that, but yeah, actually thinking about it, yeah, you certainly
the sweeter one is the more manly drink, and the more traditional, in inverted commas, diet one is the one that's marketed at women, which is, yeah, you wonder what it is that makes people in the boardrooms think, right, we know what we're going to do with that. But fascinating point, the relative absence of that kind of targeted advertising and the alcohol side of things.
Exactly. I mean, there's a advert from the 1920s from Stromness distillery, which no longer operates, and it is simply a couple, nicely dressed young couple, kissing in a boat. There doesn't seem to be any whiskey around at all, and you kind of wonder, what was that? What were they marketing to there? It's hideously mawkish, and who were they aiming that for? Does it mean that, if your fiance drinks whiskey from Stromness Distillery, he'll become more romantic? I don't know what they were aiming for, but it certainly doesn't scream "buy my whiskey" at me, at least. So it's an interesting field.
Yeah, it certainly is. Yeah, it's bizarre sometimes. You think, well, what are they going for? But clearly somebody thinks it works, and presumably it does in some cases. A question for Fleur here from Gabby. Remote schooling, sigh. That sounds like that's from bitter experience. That was slow, limited by broadband and devices. How significant does Fleur think that the disadvantage was to people who are learning online during the past year in Orkney? So if you've got any thoughts on that, Fleur.
When the pandemic started, this general comment is I felt very sorry for the people who don't have connectivity in the island, because suddenly life went from in person to everything was online. And I know I live in Kirks, so I've got connectivity, but I know plenty of people who live in Orkney who have rubbish connectivity. So I have a lot of feeling for those people and islanders who don't have any connectivity available to them, or very poor connectivity. I know there were bits and pieces in the media about trying to combat these issues, but nothing's really going to be solved until there's universal coverage, is there? So that's probably my comment on the situation. I mean, people have tried to do the best they can, but there's only so much you can do with poor connectivity. I know before the pandemic, in a few islands, they would actually say at schools, we don't give our students any online homework or anything which needs to be looked up on the internet, because we know they're going to have to look it up, because we know that some students won't have that capability at home, so they used to print things out. So I'm not sure if that continued or not across the pandemic, but I would hope that there'd be something in place for people to keep on their education while this is going on.
Thank you very much for that. And I'm sorry, we're going to have to move quickly on, I think, to the next question. And this one is directed more towards Annie, and it's from Sue Dyke. And another great talk, Annie, which I think all of us who live in Orkney are interested in. Yes, we certainly are. It will be even more interesting to see what happens next. It sounds like you expect not too much policy regarding tourism for Orkney will change, despite the challenges the industry changes. Who is responsible for the policy, and why do you think that there could be a choice to more or less try to return to what went before, rather than perhaps taking the opportunity to press the reset button?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question, I think, especially the part of who is responsible for this, because that has been one of the huge issues as well in Orkney. I think it has helped a lot that the Destination Orkney Limited was established a few years ago. So now there is a partnership actually with the council and the destination management organization. So there are two Destination Orkneys, which are really confusing. So there's a partnership, and there is the Destination Orkney, which is the tourism businesses, and there's Visit Scotland, and then there's the RSPB and Historic Monument Scotland and the Scottish National Heritage. So they're kind of the partnership now. So they actually do work together now and work together on the strategic management of tourism. So that's a huge step forward. But then there are also people that are excluded from that. So for instance, the cruise industry, which I think should really be part of this. Also, I'd say from my field work, farmers, should really have a voice in this, because there are really sustainability issues in that as well. So I think we move forward a lot in that respect, and I think Destination Orkney Limited is really a key factor here, but there are still definitely challenges there. Was there a second part to that question that I haven't answered? Or do I
no, I think you've you've covered it quite comprehensively there. Thank you very much. And I know we should be winding up right now, but there's just a couple of very quick, hopefully, questions that I can see there that we might be able to deal with quite quickly. The first one is for Fleur, and that was something I wondered as well, actually, once when I saw the slide. In your map of the cables, there are 2 outposts in between the Faroes and Shetland. And are they outlying outcrops or rigs or what's going on there?
New Island, no. They're actually across one of the oil fields out in Shetland to give them connectivity.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that was my best guess when I saw those. But I was wondering, maybe, actually tying everything together, maybe it's going to be the resurgence of what's it called? Swordland that Anne was talking about earlier on. That Shetland was the hilt for. It all ties together. And the other question was one just quickly for Julie, and that was, is there any information on what strength the illicit spirits and the homebrewed beer was as well? Do you have any information on that? Like, how strong are we talking about with this stuff?
Some information. I've certainly seen some quotes that say it was around 60%, so stronger than you get generally today. But I think there's also a misconception, so just very, very quickly, that the illicit whiskey is going to be paint stripper, really strong, disgusting stuff. Whereas actually there is evidence to say that the illicit distillers had no restrictions when it came to what barley and what malt they would use, because they're not paying taxes anyway. And so quite often a bar would have the legal whiskey and the illicit whiskey at a higher price. It's better quality, so people would buy the better quality illegal stuff rather than so it's not necessarily rip your throat out paint stripper. It can actually be really good quality, nice whiskey.
That's fascinating. Thanks very much for that. That's really interesting insights into the whiskey industry and the unseen side of the whiskey industry, and really, really interesting insights into the present and future of Orkney as well, and how best to go forward with tourism and how best to move forward with connectivity as well. And I'm sorry that we've got to wind things up just now, but it's time for a probably 12.5-minute break, and we'll be starting again at past for the next panel. So I want to say again, thank you very, very much to our 3 speakers. It's been absolutely it's been an absolute pleasure to be taking part in this session, and hope you now have a very well deserved cup of tea.
Okay, well, I guess we better start fairly promptly, especially if you're as poor timekeepers as I was this morning. I'm a very strange person to put in charge of timekeeping. So welcome back, everybody. Hopefully people are starting to log back on. The first talk for this next session is from Heidi Stoner, who's a postdoctoral researcher at Durham University. She's going to be talking about the image of the cross, an assessment of early medieval ecclesiastical sculpture and settlement.
Well, thank you very much. So how I kind of want to begin this talk is to kind of tell you a little bit about my research, and I've kind of selected 4 sort of case studies that I'm going to kind of whiz through. And if you have any further questions about any of them, do ask me, but I didn't want to spend too much time getting you bogged down in some details. And I'm really going to talk about the way memory is established through monuments, and how the use of sites and the reuse of sites and the rededication of sites is something that we need to spend a bit more time thinking about, and thinking about in kind of more complex ways, particularly in an interdisciplinary fashion. See if I can move to the next slide. So the kind of normal way in which people would talk about memory and sculpture and monuments is kind of looking at one of these sorts of sculptures. It has a sort of memorial inscription, it memorializes a person, and this is a way in which we can kind of study the past and use this sculpture to look at kind of the human and memory aspects of that. But one of the ways I want to kind of do this in a little bit of a different way is to talk about this site, St Gregory's Minster at Kirkdale. And yes, I have included North Yorkshire in the Irish Sea region. It's because I have an elastic definition of most of those things. This site is a deeply complex site, and it's a site that has been studied many, many times. And it's a site that has a complex kind of group of sculptures. You have kind of early 8th century grave covers, which you can see in the bottom left-hand corner. You have a Roman sundial that's been reused and has a kind of 11th century inscription. And then you have this other kind of sculptures that are included as spolia, visible spolia in the church wall. The most kind of well-studied object is this sundial. And it says, and I've included all of the inscriptions here on the screen, and it is in a Old English with a Norse-leaning language, and it kind of says, well, it says, Orm, son of Gamel, bought St Gregory's Minster when it was all ruined and collapsed, and he caused it to be made new from the ground for Christ and St Gregory in the days of Edward the King and in the days of Totsty the Earl. So this gives us a very clear dating of this, which we can talk about. We can talk about the language used, we can talk about the sort of paleographic elements, but I actually think we don't spend enough time talking about what it actually says. Here is a man, Orm, who has bought a church site. He has rebuilt it and rededicated it. And this is in a period where we don't think of the church being rededicated. We don't think of churches being built. We think of a lot of sort of destruction. And I don't think we understand the sort of Viking age, for lack of a better word, repatronage. And the reason I start with this one is because St. Gregory bought this church, or not St. Gregory, Orm buys this church. St. Gregory's Minster is rebuilt, it is rededicated, and it is reformed. And the reforming of this site is done in a way that gives us an insight into what they are thinking when they rebuild this site. They take the sculpture, and it is all broken, as it says in the inscription, and they put it in the walls of this building, and they put it visibly in the wall. Now, Meg Bolton has argued that the two early sculptures are placed in the west front as a sort of spolia and has a sort of exegetical meaning about entering the veil and coming through into the church. But I think we can extend that to include all of the sculpture. If you move around the church from sort of left to right, as I have it on the screen, you have a sort of narrative about the broken pieces. They are essentially chronological, and they include every aspect of this site, rebuilding it, rededicating it, and putting themselves, Orm puts himself within this narrative. So the church spoliation is presented together, memorializing the church, the history, and those who have a role in it, giving space to contemplate not only the history, the past, present, and future of the church, with a big C, but also this church and their own history in that church. Now, moving to the Irish Sea properly, Mackald is a site that I spent quite a lot of time working on in my research, and it has an impressive collection of sculpture. Unlike St. Gregory's, we don't have necessarily an idea of where this sculpture comes from. It's all kind of ex situ, and it's been moved around and mucked about with quite a lot over this. So I think you have to kind of take that with a grain of salt, but still try and interpret it within the context of the individual sites that we might associate each of these sculptures with. And one of the sort of most impressive, quote unquote, sculptures is this stone, and it has been interpreted as the foundation stone of the site. And it has these sort of three inscriptions and kind of moving around. The site itself has 8 monuments that are considered from the early period, or the pre-Viking period, which is how the sculpture on the Isle of Man is dated, although much of that needs to be reassessed. It hasn't had a proper assessment since 1907. And these inscriptions all evoke a high level of literacy. It has led people to argue that this is perhaps a monastic site. And this stone itself says around the roundel here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but around the round bit, it invokes the name of a bishop. Ipsley was bishop of all of this island. Now, we can spend a lot of time talking about whether a bishop can be at a monastery, but I'm not sure that that is necessarily going to be the most productive use of our time. And there's, some questions about the Latin and how one might divide it. But again, I think if we take this monument for what it says, it does say that there is a bishop of this island. It does give us a sense that this is a highly impressive ecclesiastical site. There's another sculpture that I've not included in this particular talk, but talks about bringing water up to the site. So I think we get a sense of a fairly complex early site here. Now, Mackle does have a later sculptural tradition, this, a so-called Viking Age tradition. And I've included on the right-hand side of this slide here, several, this to be either late Inster or Viking Age. But they are not the sculptures we most often talk about when we talk about the Viking island of Man. Those sculptures are here pictured on the left, and I've only included a couple for reference because we will mainly be talking about Mackle here. But it doesn't have the sort of runic inscriptions that you find at places like Andreas or Derby or Michael. It doesn't have the intertwined beasts that you can see here at Michael. It doesn't have the sort of Odinic figures or Sigurd figures that we might talk about, although whether or not those are true identifications is something that needs to be problematized as well. But what I actually think that this tells us is that there's something interesting happening on the Isle of Man. You have several sites that have these sort of more personal, monumental, maybe secular iconographic programs, and they are all within walking distance and a sort of kind of satellite sites to this original site, Mackle, the early site. And nearly all of the runic inscriptions on the Isle of Man come from the north of the island. There are very few from the south, which is why I've kind of cut off the bottom of the island on my map here. And you are getting a very different sort of iconographic program. So I think we can think of this as a school of satellite sites in a sort of hinterland to an early site that is getting this sort of re-foundation. Mackle does have a runic inscription, however, it is much later than the traditional phase of runic inscriptions on the Isle of Man. And here I have it written out for you here, and it uses, look at my notes, it has the Hegel rune, which is the only usage of it on the Isle of Man, and it has an O rune, which is attested at Maeshowe and Orkney. This kind of places this inscription solidly into the 12th century, into our earlier Viking phase. It also has this graffiti on it, which I have put here, but it is very difficult to see in pictures, and I appreciate if none of you can see it, but I promise you it is there. I have faith time, I'm afraid. So what does that tell us? That all of the crosses dated to the so-called Viking Age at Mackle are not in the style of what we consider Viking Age Manx crosses. Well, I think that tells us that we have a problem, not that the early medieval stone sculpture has a problem. We've misinterpreted something at this site. Mackle has some of the finest borough-style ring chain, and actually I will go back and try and show that. Oh, that was perhaps a mistake. Very sorry. So here on this sculpture, here on this sculpture, this is very fine, very stylized very specifically 10th century sculpture. This is concurrent with all of these sculptures, and they are less than 10 miles apart. So these two schools of sculpture are existing at the same time. These are both products of the Viking Age, whatever we think that might mean. So what this tells me is that what is happening at these sites is different. The patronage at Mackles is different than that of these other sites, and therefore we need to think a little bit more nuanced about what we consider Viking Age sculpture. And I want to draw your attention to this figure here, which is a dedicatory figure, which is again from the 10th century. So if this is another dedication stone, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, this site is the site cannot be a site that is in decline, given the amount of material that's so. Now, we have two more inscriptions from bear some relevance on how we might think about this site as it moves through time. This particular stone, and it's carved, and so it's a graffitied carving, but it says, John the priest cut these runes. And underneath this, he writes out the Futhark, which is the runic alphabet, and he writes out the Ogham alphabet just underneath it. I think it is a boastful kind of notion, of course, that he can do this. And this has traditionally been dated to either the 11th or the 12th century. John has left these runes, but these are from a different site. This is Christ, Malachi, Patrick, and Advanan, but of all of the sheep, John is priest in Cornerdale. Now this site is a little chapel site. Let me see if I can move you guys, and you can see I've put in what that site looks like there. And so this is not the original site, but this has often been argued to be part of the original monastic landholding of this site. So if we compare it to sites like Iona and to Lindisfarne, this seems like a hermitage that has some attachment to the site. And if that is the case in the early period, what we might be seeing is that is still the case in the 12th century. And so I think this shows that the site itself has continuity. Moving on to one of our other case studies, I'm going to talk a little bit about Iona today. And I'm sure that no one needs to be told very much about Iona because it is one of the most famous early medieval sites. But the two pieces of sculpture I want to talk about are famous, rather Iona 95 and 94, which I have put on the right-hand side of the screen here. These two pieces of sculpture have been argued to maybe come from the Isle of Man. And this gives us a sense that there is some relationship between possibly Mackles and Iona. And there has been some queries, and we've gone back and forth about whether or not these sculptures are geologically associated with the Isle of Man. I am firmly of the opinion that they are, although I have been told that we're doing some more analysis, so, you know, watch this space. Maybe I'm completely wrong, which is fine, obviously. But this particular piece, I think, is deeply associated. This fine carving, this sort of shaly material looks very, very similar to these kind of fragmented pieces that you find at Mackles. And then you have this piece, Iona 95. This has the sort of Derby, Andreas, or Bride style of carving, in that it has kind of more figurative carving, in that it might reference kind of Scandinavian or mythological scenes. It has been compared to the sculptures at Leeds, Halton, and Numburnham, sorry, which is why people, particularly Jim Lang, questioned the Manx origin of this piece. However, I would like to bring attention to this Numburnham cross and show you the deep carving on each side, and it's a massively different shape, and geologically they're not similar at all. Iona 95, having looked at it myself, I think can only come from somewhere that has shale deposits, which Cumbria and North Yorkshire do not. So that is going to become a difficult interpretation. So the Royal Commission of Ancient Historical Monuments for Iona does make a brief mention of this, but given its sort of questionable origins, the relationship with Man and Mackles isn't well established. However, I think their find site is particularly interesting. They are found at the Chapel of St. Oran. And let me see if I can find the date, in 1904, when Collingwood first identified this stone 95 here, the one with the boat, he immediately says it looks like the Manx crosses, but he suggests that it is a grave monument for the 12th century Guthrum Olafsson, who we know is buried on Iona. If that is the case, which I'm not suggesting it is because I don't think it is, this stone would have to already be 2 centuries old when it arrives on Iona. But that is perhaps, if we think about the way stone sculpture is being used at Kirkdale, perhaps there is a revisiting of these older motifs. Perhaps those sculptures that are moved to the Chapel of Oran are being moved there as a sort of monumental memorialization of this site. I don't think it's Guthrum, however, because Guthrum dies at Peel, and he is not associated with that northern school of sites. So while we might have textual evidence for Guthrum being buried on Iona, that does not necessarily match with our material evidence, but that doesn't mean both of those two things can't be true. And actually that makes this site and this story a bit more complicated and perhaps a bit more interesting. The last kind of example I wanted to bring up, kind of think about when we're thinking about this sort of rededication, revitalization, and looking at new sites, is Papabura, and I'm sorry, I'm probably pronouncing the place names incredibly incorrectly, cross. So this one is now in the National Museum of Scotland, but I believe that there is a replica on Shetland itself, although I've yet to be able to go because I was hoping to get a picture of it last year, and obviously we didn't make it. But what is happening in this stone is you have these figures on either side of a cross, and this is an iconography that I've argued elsewhere is an iconography of dedication. And this isn't terribly revolutionary. I think quite a lot of people have talked a bit about this, but these clerical figures on either side of a cross, I think, can be interpreted as foundation documents, much like the foundation stone document at Mackles, where you have 2 crosses on either side of a central cross, which has either a name or inscription. Well, we don't have the inscription here. Perhaps there is some significance to these other figures down below. People much more clever and invested in Pictish sculpture would probably be able to tell you a bit more about that. But I think this combination of this sort of inscripted, incised, possibly ethnic, possibly linguistic iconography alongside these sort of clerical figures on either side of the cross makes this a foundation document to some extent. This has been interpreted on the right hand side as an altar front. Here you have similar figures processing to what might be considered a standing cross. Perhaps this is retelling of the story about the dedication of this site. Here you have several more of these figures on either side of crosses from a variety of sites that I have worked on, and I'm currently trying to suggest that this is part of a 10th century iconographic program about rededication of older sites. All of these come from sites that have earlier traditions and are then rededicated. But our Papalborough site is necessarily a rededication, but we do have what appears to be a very similar iconographic program at a site very nearby, we have the two figures. We have the cross, we have its central motif, we have our little beastie friend down below, and on this one we have an Ogham inscription, and there are little beasts on either top. And if anyone's familiar with some of the other Meagle sculptures, those might look slightly familiar. What I think we're having here as well is, again, an investment in an iconography about rededication and remembering old sites. I think this demonstrates to us that the Irish Sea is invested in this narrative about maintaining the past, rededicating the past, and rebuilding the past. So despite the fact that Viking Age sculpture is often seen as a destructive and degenerate form of sculpture, I think they themselves would identify each of these sculptures as dedicating and rebuilding the ecclesiastical sites of the Irish Sea region. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. That's great.
Let me see if I can...
Just a time as well. Excellent.
I tried very hard.
Well done. Okay, we'll save questions till the end. So if we can move on now, Alan Fraser is going to present, I think, the first part, and then Jenny is going to come in with the second part of the 3 Kirks in Shetland.
Okay, I'll just looking for the share screen thing. Hang on. Try again. How does that look, folks? Can you see me or hear me? Or?
Yeah, we can hear you, and the slides coming through fine.
Okay, I could just see the drop down here. I can't get rid of it. That's it. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. The talk this afternoon is on St. Magnus and the 3 Sisters Kirks. It's really a detective story that myself and Jenny went on. So we have a mystery, circumstantial evidence, we have a forensic evidence, we have a murder, and we have a religious cult. So you can think of Jenny and myself as perhaps as a medieval Jimmy Perez and Tosh. Okay, if I can get to the first slide. About 3 years ago, I called along the museum, and Jenny was cataloguing this altar stone that had been found just recently at Aishines. And I made the remark that it wasn't Shetland sandstone. In fact, I thought it was actually Orkney sandstone. And I had seen similar sandstone in the St. Lawrence Kirk, or the rubble of St. Lawrence Kirk in Papel and Borough, where the previous speaker's stone was found, in fact. So I took a sample of the sandstone from St. Lawrence and Papel, and they're pretty close match visibly. So St. Lawrence, the 19th century St. Lawrence ruin we see today, was built on the site of one of 3 Norse round tower kirks, and these were reputedly gifted to Shetland by 3 Norwegian sisters, probably sometime in the 12th century. The other 2 round tower kirks, St. Magnus Kirk in Tingwell, which is north of Scalway, and St. Mary Kirk in Ireland, that's the Birton Island near St. Ninian's Isle. But unfortunately, the towers for these 3 kirks and the kirks themselves were demolished in the late 1700s and in the early 1800s. But we carried on to do some research, and that confirmed that all 3 were partially constructed or refurbished by red sandstone imported from Orkney. So what did a round tower kirk look like? Well, we went to Ecclesy in Orkney to have a look at the only existing one there. And the tower, as it stands today, is 16 metres high. but originally it would have been 21 meters high. So this is a very impressive tower in the landscape, or beacon in the landscape, if you like. So what did the Shetland ones look like? Well, contemporary authors, visitors to Shetland at the time, described the Tingwell and Papal Kirks as having towers of hewn stone between 60 and 70 feet high. That's over 20 meters. Now, there's no, we can find a description of the height of the one at St Mary in Ireland, but it's probably similar. But it was demolished on the order of the Laird because it was becoming dangerous. And Gaudi in his notebook noted it fell, and some of the houses of Ireland were built out of it, and every stone gradually disappeared. So we did expect to find some of the stones from the tower or from the kirk around about in the buildings in Ireland. So what about the Tingwell North Kirk today? At the time that the North Kirk was demolished in about 1798, the master builder estimated that 500 to 600 tons of red sandstone was available in the tower for reuse in building the present-day kirk. That information comes from the kirk records at the time and is in the book, The History of the Tingwell Kirk by George Nelson. And Nelson, when he wrote this book, also had some geological analysis done of the red sandstone from the tower, or reputed from the tower, and that he concluded that red sandstone came from Orkney. So that's the line of investigation that myself and Jenny went on. So if you go to the St Magnus Kirk in Tingwell today, what you see there is the present-day kirk, built in 1798. But the green mound, the grass-covered mound you see, is called Mitchell's Isle or Mitchell's Vault. And it was connected to the North Kirk by a door and a stair in the east end of the kirk, which is the west end of the mound, which is here. And when that was blocked off, and the other end of the vault was opened into the kirkyard, and this was reportedly done in 1742 from the kirk records. Now, if we go inside Mitchell's Isle and have a look, the back wall that was blocked, that's the wall that was blocked off the stairway to the kirk, to the North Kirk, the North Tower Kirk above. It's built with red sandstone and blocked off with red sandstone isolated blocks, some of which are lying about on the floor, and we cleaned them up, and there's the same bright red sandstone as we'd seen in the altarpiece that Jenny was looking at earlier. And if you go out into the kirkyard itself, some of the older walls there also have red sandstone isolated blocks within them. Now, if we go south down to Papal, this is where the Papal stone we were talking about earlier came from. You see the ruins of the 19th century St Lawrence Kirk. And it was, well, when you go to investigate it, you see that inside there's quite a lot of recycled red sandstone isolated blocks in the walls, in the door jambs, and especially in the bell tower. The bell tower being too high to climb up, we did get the drone up to get some drone pictures fairly recently. Most interestingly is there's quite a lot of very good condition blocks of red sandstone recycled in the bell tower. So these ones can't have been exposed to weathering since the 12th century. But on the top of the bell tower, there are some that obviously have been an exterior part of a building or a tower, and they're heavily weathered. Then we go a bit further south to Ireland, which is not far from St Ninian's Isle, where St Mary Kirk was. There's no evidence on the ground of the kirk or the tower at the moment that we could find, but there's a name, and this field here is called Steeple Green. And the cottage behind this white house, you could just see the roof line in the chimney, is called Steeple Cottage. where the tower of the round tower of the kirk was supposedly stood. But there's no evidence on the ground because it's all been agriculturally removed. But we did ask around the local crafters and householders if there's any red sandstone. And we found some. One piece had been given to the museum, was actually in the museum collection. And it's fairly obviously the same red sandstone as we've been looking for. And one of the local crafters, James Tate, he had a doorstop. And that was made of dressed sandstone, a sandstone block from St Mary Kirk. So we got all our Shetland sandstone samples together, and we decided that we would take core samples from them and send off to the British Geological Survey's building stone department analysis. We actually found two types of red sandstone, a type 1 and a type 2. The type 1 being a darker red, the type 2 being a brighter red. And we got them from all three sites. Sampling was done by taking cores. It was kindly done from Chemison. It was all labelled and sent off for analysis. We also went to Orkney. Now this is a quarry at the head of Holland. It's actually a series of quarry steps cut into the headland. And this is where the red sandstone that built St Magnus Cathedral was taken from. And you look in the photograph in the far distance, you can see Kirkwall and just make out the outline of the cathedral. So we took samples of type 1 and type 2 sandstone from the quarry. And we sent them off to the Geological Survey to compare with our samples and with samples they have from St Magnus Cathedral. And the results we got back were better than even I'd expected, really. I won't go into the details, but their final conclusion was, this leaves little doubt that all the samples come from within the same bedrock unit, supporting a hypothesis that masonry used to build the Shetland churches came from the quarries in the 80 group bedrock on Orkney, which is the quarry that we've been looking at. So this is St Magnus Cathedral, and you can see it's a magnificent building built from the red sandstone, built from these red ashlar blocks. And this was, of course, quarried at the head of Holland. I went inside to spend a rainy day, and outside as well. I measured the dimensions, the 3 dimensions of as many blocks of type 1 and type 2 that I could find. And this was to compare the dimensions of the blocks here at Kirkwall with the ones we had in Shetland. And I got a surprising result, that when I did a statistical analysis on the standard block size, and plotted them against the Shetland examples, they all plotted more or less together. And that gave us a result that the blocks from made in Orkney for St Magnus Cathedral were the same size as the blocks that we found in Shetland. So that begs the question, did the masons working in St Magnus Cathedral export cut blocks to Shetland to build the tower for the Kirk at Tingwall and refurbish or even build towers for the other 2 kirks? So this was a kind of question we left hanging in the air until we got a surprising gift. We got a remarkable survivor. This is a red sandstone piscina, fairly obviously the same sandstone. It was found in a croft at Cheshunt to St Lawrence Kirk, Papel and Borough. This is the top side of the piscina where the water was poured, and that's the bottom side where the drain hole is. It's been broken in half, but it's very clearly a piscina. And what we've made inquiries with St Magnus Cathedral in Kirkwall, and we found there were almost identical piscinas in the cathedral. Not only that, they were in the oldest part of the cathedral, in the phase 1 part of St Magnus Cathedral. They're the same dimensions to within 2 centimetres. In fact, they're so similar that they might well be made by the same stonemason. So our conclusions so far, and our research is still ongoing, that at the time of building St Magnus Cathedral, a complete red sandstone tower was built at Kirk, and there was at the very least refurbishment of tower kirks at Papel and at Ireland, Bicton, using red sandstone Eisler blocks imported from Orkney. However, to quarry, fashion into Eisler blocks and export many hundred tons of red sandstone to Shetland had to be a well-organised operation. I've done a first approximation, and at least 10% of the Head of Holland quarry output was shipped to Shetland during the first phase of the building of St Magnus Cathedral. Now, this was a huge and expensive undertaking, whoever took it on, and it had to be for a very compelling reason. So we need to now ask who, by, and why. Now, this is how the three kirks might have looked. This is courtesy of the miracle of Photoshop, St Magnus Tower, St Lawrence Tower, and St Mary the Tower. Now, the Orkney saga tells us that St Magnus had three sisters, Gudhilda, Cecilia, and Jaffa. Were they the three sisters that gifted the three kirks to Shetland? Jenny might be able to take it on from here and tell you a little bit more about that. Now, I'm going to try and get rid of my screen now. Can you hand over to Jenny?
That's it, hand it over.
Jenny, you're on mute, I think. No, still on mute.
Hooray! Sorry about that. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay. Sorry, I probably run a wee bit late now, so my apologies already. So thanks, Alan, for that. And although this conference is about women, we shouldn't let the St Magnus Conference go without a paper about the man himself. So thank you for accepting our paper. Alan is the scientist, and he's given you the science, and I will now furnish you with our research for who we think the people are involved. So Alan's done the science bit, and now you're going to get Coronation Street bit. Our first character in our tale is St Magnus himself. The story of how Earl Magnus Erlendsson came to be murdered on the island of Ecclesia due to the ongoing dynastic conflict with his cousin Haakon over the earldom lands has been related by many authors and historians. Earl Magnus was duped by his cousin Haakon and killed by Haakon's cook while praying in a small kirk on the island of Ecclesia in Orkney at Easter time around 1116 or 17. Magnus has been Shetland's earl, and Shetlanders seem to have been very loyal to this branch of the earldom. Magnus died a martyr to his religion and his people. In 1919, workmen discovered a skeleton in a wooden chest hidden within one of the pillars of the Kirkwall Cathedral, and it is believed to be that of St Magnus. Our next character is Earl Ronald Calle Colson, probably born in Norway. He was born to Earl Magnus' sister, Gunhilda Erlendsdatter, and Collar Callison. In Shetland, he would have been described. In Shetland, we would describe Ronald as a ladom. Gilbert Gowdy described him as a hero of rollicking type who travelled far as a crusader to the Holy Land and elsewhere. The sagas tell us that he undertook pilgrimage between 1151 and 53. Ronald was a skald, a poet who documented his travels in his verse, and in some which he notes he swam across the river Jordan and he partied in Grimsby. Following the murder of his uncle, the mission to regain Earl Magnus's lands was planned by his surviving siblings and their families. Following acknowledgement from the King of Norway that the heirs of Magnus had the rights to the lands in Orkney and Shetland, their next step was to continue to assert their rights politically, and particularly by winning the hearts and minds of the islanders. Orkney Inga saga tells us that Ronald's father steered and advised Ronald forward in claiming his lands, but we would like to think that his mother, Gunhilda, was strongly encouraging him too. Born Callie Colson, it was Gunhilda that suggested her son change his name to Ronald, taking the name of a previous earl. Ronald based himself in Shetland when he started his claim for his half of the earldom. It appears from the sagas that both Earl Magnus and now Ronald had the support of the Shetlanders. One path they took in achieving this aim was to cultivate and promote a cult for the murdered Magnus, stressing his good Christian values and devoutness. Magnus' sainthood was eventually achieved through the best efforts of Earl Ronald and Bishop William, 20 years after his death, around 1137, and building of the cathedral in Kirkwall was started at that point to house his saintly remains. Magnus has been described as a martyr for the faith and a protector of the faith. As a national saint, he was representing the earldom of Orkney and a symbol of religious and national identity. The Book of Miracles tells us of a succession of Shetland men and women who made their way to Orkney to be cured at the grave of Earl Magnus, so we know that Shetlanders were heavily invested in the cult of Magnus. Bishop William's role in the promotion of the Magnus cult was all important. He was under pressure from rival bishops in the north during this period, so increasing his ecclesiastical power in Kirkwall would have been a significant factor in his support of Ronald in establishing the cult of St. Magnus. With any Christian cult, veneration of the saint's relics is crucial. These small bones or personal possessions belonging to the saint were believed to hold divine power, which would help gain a cure. The skeletal remains found in the cathedral and believed to be that of St. Magnus were examined by Professor Reid in 1926, and his report highlighted some missing bones, including finger phalanges. Documents show that a relic of St. Magnus was sent to Faroes, Iceland, and another to Prague, so it's entirely probable that one was taken to Tingwall Kirk, known in Shetland as the Midderkerk, or Mother Church. Oh, sorry. If the three sisters' kirks were built in Shetland to further the cult of the St. Magnus, it is possible that one of his relics may have been translated here, so that pilgrims didn't have to make the journey to Orkney. Or were the three tower churches visually important in leading pilgrims to Orkney down the west coast of Shetland as stations of the pilgrimage? And you can see that the picture I took here of Ecclesy shows that they were very prominent in landscape from a wide area. Various charts show the Tower of St. Magnus Kirk as a marker to help navigation into Scalwa Harbour. You can see Tingwall Kirk marked there, and the Burgh Kirk is here, and the Ireland Kirk is down at the bottom. It's mentioned in the 1680 to the south of Scalwa. To the south of Scalwa, there is, if you come in the south entry, no danger keeping the middle channel and the church and steeple of Tingwall in your eye. In conclusion, our research has added an important dimension and a new chapter to the history of the medieval church in Shetland and Orkney during the 12th century. Science has proven without a doubt that the red sandstone used to build or refurbish towers of the three Norse kirks came from Orkney quarries, and the ashlar blocks used were most likely shaped by the masons building St. Magnus Cathedral in Kirkwall. Church furniture may also have been supplied in the form, as we saw, of the papal Husayna and the small portable altar from Eshness that started Mian-Aln's journey of discovery. These red towers would have been proud in the landscape, both a visual and spiritual beacon for the local community who came to worship and gain healing with the help of their island saint, the martyred Earl who had been liked and respected by Shetlanders before his untimely murder. The towers may also have contained a bell, so it would have been a call to the faithful. Earl Ronald, with the support of Bishop William, may have ordered the Shetland kirks to be built or refurbished to promote this cult of his uncle, and they had much to gain as the rise of the cult brought them more power and income. Professor Barbara Crawford has spent much of her working life researching the earldom of Orkney, and she writes, political and ecclesiastical change is happening throughout Europe during the 12th century. Small landowners' privately owned chapels were being enlarged and parish churches erected, creating a new sense of Christian community. And Dr. Sarah Jane Gibbon in Orkney has been researching the cult of St. Magnus and his pilgrimage walks over the last few years, and her PhD looked at social change associated with the Kirk during this period. She notes as the earldom was being reformed under Ronald, a parish-based society was being created with church tithes and scatter or taxes being collected. These new parish churches were the only ones now used for baptism and burial. Shetland's 3 towered kirks must have played a major role in this change, and with his power base and administration in Kirkwall, Ronald and, it has to be said, Bishop William were now in control. There's still much research to do. I'll maybe skip this if we're running a bit late, but there is an old house on the bay of St. Magnus Bay. When we were working with the community, this guy got in touch and said that he'd been refurbishing, which is reputed to be the oldest house in Hillswick. And he'd uncovered some ecclesiastical looking architecture here, and there's some red sandstone and yellow, and we did send some yellow for analysis, and it was also from Orkney. And also in a nearby building, me and Alan found some more red sandstone, so there's much more research to do. And also, as a final thing, our research was funded by the Museum Gallery Scotland Recognition Fund, and part of that we sponsored Andy Ross on a handloom to make us a new altar cloth for our display. And he's called the cloth Remembering St. Magnus, and he used Shetland wool sponsored by Chemisons of Shetland, and he's making scarves and blankets and things. And this is my final slide is our new display in the Shetland Museum with his lovely, beautiful new altar cloth and some loans from Orkney Museum. And I'm afraid out of the picture is our red sandstone, that bits and pieces that I didn't get in the picture. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. That was great, and well done for cutting the time down. I know it's very difficult to modify your talk.
That was a bit of a rush.
No, you did well. Okay, we have got some time, and we have at least a few questions. There's one here from Jane Ann Dennison. I'll kind of abbreviate it a little bit. Are there any churches out with the Northern Isles that have possible links to stonemasons? I'm going to kind of modify that slightly so that I can include Heidi as well. You've both talked about materials coming from other sites and links being made through the appropriation of material from other places. I wonder if you've got any further thoughts, either of you, or all three of you, really.
Can I go first, if that's okay? Because I was just going to say there's also red sandstone blocks that's under the church and the foundations of the church at Bursey in Orkney, St. Magnus Church there. So we know that there's other churches, but I have looked in Caithness, where St. Magnus was also Earl, and as yet I've not found any red sandstone in Caithness, but that's part of the research that I would love to do, is to try and find out more.
What I could say about St. Magnus Cathedral is that it was almost certainly built by masons from Durham. St. Magnus Cathedral is a half-scale model of Durham, really. And the quarrying was probably done by gangs who had quarried sandstone for Durham.
Yeah, and Dunfermline as well, I believe.
Yeah.
And Dunfermline, yeah, they did Dunfermline on the way north, yeah.
And yeah, I can jump in a bit. If you're interested in the kind of movement of stones, particularly at Iona, Adrian Maldonado and Catherine Forsyth have done a study on that, and I think it was published in 2012. So that is where I would look primarily for that information. But kind of more generally, I think we are getting movement of some stones, maybe not as kind of long distance as that. And I think there is clearly a sort of maintenance. I have a couple of sites in Ireland that I am hoping to kind of suggest that might be happening at, as well as some sites kind of in and around sort of the northeast. But the difficulty with a lot of what I'm working on, particularly at Mackles, is actually I have everything is kind of ex situ. So a couple of the Mackles stones, we don't really know if they're from the Mackles site itself or just from the parish more generally. And so I don't want to make too big of a claims there for things that I just can't know.
Yeah, I think that, watching you talk there, about moving stones that have been carved already been produced, which that probably applies to the Chinese altar stone as well. That's come up as almost in somebody's pocket, it's pocket size. But the thing that surprised me about the Shetland experience was shipping something like nearly 1,000 tons of stone from Orkney to Shetland. The expense and the effort taken to do that was remarkable. I mean, they had to have a really good reason to do it. I did try to work out how many shiploads, but it's kind of difficult. You don't know how long the process went on, and how much. When you try to research the size of the knar or that type of vessel, you come up with different cargo sizes, ranging from 3.5 ton cargo to 50-ton cargoes. You know, I guess they're looking at maybe 24-ton cargoes. So you've got to see even shipping that sort of sandstone, 600,000 tons. It's going to take you a long time, given you can only do it in summer and so on. So there's a lot of thinking to do about it yet, I think. But the sandstone was definitely there, so somebody had to move it.
I wonder if I can take a slightly different tack. What do you think the motive was for trying to create a link with Orkney? Was it an act of reconciliation or reunion between fissured parts of the earldom, or is it some sort of cultural appropriation and just commercial opportunism on the back of the success of the St. Magnus cult? What do you think's actually going on there, socially and politically?
That one, Jenny?
Well, I mean, the earldom at this point was including Orkney, Shetland, and Caithness, so they're very much together. And I think that you can see that with the amount of pilgrims that we know in the Orkney and Cassidy that are listed, that Shetland was very much invested anyway in that journey down to Orkney and to be part of it. So I don't think we should maybe see them as separate at this point.
Yeah, I think Earl Ronald was trying to consolidate his power base as well, because his father did say to him on his first expedition to conquer or take back Orkney, remember, the Shetlanders are your friends. So that might be a clue to what was going on.
And do we have any knowledge of the ownership of the actual quarry? I presume that would have been a consideration as well.
You mean the Head of Holland quarry?
Yeah.
I don't know about ownership. I think it was probably the best and most convenient sandstone. I mean, the guys from the masons from Durham would have come up and said, "Look, lads, this is probably the best stuff you've got. We can ship it across the bay. It's easy transport." There's probably better sandstone in Orkney. They wouldn't weather so quickly, but much more difficult to get. So I think that was what was easiest for the masons and for transport. And I think that was the case with Durham as well.
Sorry, I was just going to add, we know that the Durham masons are moving kind of large amounts of sandstone quite long distances, because they are also responsible for Lindisfarne, and it's not like they've gotten that stone there either. And I think the research that they've done on that is that they are moving it by water. kind of across. So I think they would be a fairly kind of well-versed group of people to have done that move for you in Orkney.
The quote I've seen in a paper on Durham was that the quarry themselves was a gang of 8 men were employed at 100 pence per week, and one gang would cut 75 50-kilogram blocks. That's 1.5 tons per week. So you think that Durham, the phase 1 of Durham was 12,000 tons. How many men that took? Then I think about St Magnus Cathedral, that's half the size of Durham, but their phase 1, 6,000 tons. And that's just the cut blocks. That's not including the rubble for the walls or the sand and the lime mortar. So you're talking, if you add those on, you're talking 15,000 tons or more for Durham, 10,000 tons for for Kirkle, phase 1. So it's a big, big operation, especially for medieval times when you've got no mechanical diggers and stuff.
Okay, that's great. I think we're kind of at the break time, so and obviously people are free to hang around and talk a little bit longer, but people should probably go off and get their coffees and go to the watering hole before the last session of the afternoon. Okay, and thank you very much again. Well done, both of you.
Thank you.
Excellent talks.
And Heidi, we need to talk.
Okay. Now or some other time.
No, well, maybe we'll need a long time to chat, so I'll
Yeah.
get in touch.
No, do. And actually, all going well, I'm meant to be coming north this May now because my contract is up at the end of May, and so they've moved my through. So.
Okay, well, if you, Andrew will put us both in touch, and I can meet you and take you to some of these sites.
Excellent. That would be great. Thank you so much.
And Al will be back here by then too, so we'll go on a tour.
Yeah, I was in the Isle of Man last year. I was at Maggle last year, and I also last year, the year before last now, and I was also looking at the Peel Tower as well. Peel. So.
Yeah.
I'm looking at towers more than crosses, but it's all the same.
Yeah.